They told me to pack my desk in 15 minutes. My new boss thought my custom algorithm was a waste of money and fired me on the spot. He had no idea he had just unplugged the heart of a massive supply chain. 5 days later, his ego cost the company $14 million in rotting inventory, and the board was begging me to name my price to fix it. Hello to all our wonderful listeners at Boss Revenge Stories. We are so grateful for your continued support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep producing these videos. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will find exclusive true stories that are longer, packed with more gritty details, and feature multiple emotional voice actors bringing the drama to life, which is content we simply cannot release publicly here. You can join our community by scanning the quick response code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Now, let us dive right into today's story, where Chloe Ross, learned exactly what happens when true competence meets loud arrogance. I am 34 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I was the quiet data architect holding together Omnifare provisions in Chicago. If you live anywhere in the American Midwest, chances are the food on your table, the bottled water in your pantry, and the emergency salt on your icy driveway got there because of my employer. Omnifare is a massive corporate beast, an absolute titan supplying groceries and daily necessities to thousands of supermarkets, convenience stores, and relief centers across a dozen states. It is an intricate, unforgiving web of logistics, a beast that demands absolute perfection every single second of the day, and I was the one who tamed it. For 7 long years, I poured every ounce of my intellect and energy into building OracleNet. It was not just a piece of software or a simple spreadsheet, it was my magnum opus, a supreme artificial intelligence predictive algorithm that I wrote entirely from scratch. Before OracleNet, the company relied on guesswork, outdated historical trends, and sheer luck. I changed that. My algorithm did not just look at what people bought last year. It breathed in the world around it. It analyzed micro-weather patterns down to the exact zip code. It scraped data on local social events, school closures, sudden traffic gridlocks, and even viral cooking trends on social media. If a high school football team won a state championship on a Friday night, OracleNet knew to route extra celebratory snacks and beverages to that specific town by Saturday morning. If a sudden rainstorm was predicted over a suburban neighborhood, my code automatically redirected shipments of umbrellas and indoor entertainment supplies to the nearest stores. It was a living, breathing entity that directed millions of tons of cargo with surgical precision to every street corner. Then came Trenton. Trenton was our newly appointed Chief Strategy Officer. He was a flashy, impeccably dressed man whose expensive cologne arrived in a room a full minute before he did, armed with a shiny Master of Business Administration degree from a school he never stopped talking about. Trenton was the physical embodiment of corporate noise. He spoke exclusively in hollow buzzwords, constantly preaching about lean optimization, synergistic realignment, and disruptive cost-cutting. He was a man utterly obsessed with slashing budgets, not to make the company better, but to paint a glorious, highly profitable picture of himself on the quarterly reports presented to the board of directors. He was a sleepwalker in the halls of real power, utterly blind to how the machinery actually worked, yet completely convinced he was the master of it all. It did not take long for Trenton to develop a deep, simmering hatred for OracleNet. The reason was incredibly simple. He did not understand it. He would stand behind my desk, staring at my dual monitors, watching streams of complex code and dynamic data models flying across the screen, and I could see the sheer, unadulterated panic behind his designer glasses. He could not manipulate my code. He could not tweak it to artificially inflate his cost-saving metrics. More importantly, he felt deeply threatened by me. I never played the corporate game. I never laughed at his unfunny jokes. I never sought his approval, and I certainly never flattered his fragile ego. To him, it was entirely unacceptable that a quiet woman who refused to fawn over his shiny title held the absolute heart of the logistics empire in her hands. Whenever a new executive arrives, the usual corporate dance begins. The middle managers and the ambitious analysts immediately start scrambling, practically tripping over themselves to kiss the ring of the new boss. They would pack into his endless, absolutely pointless strategy meetings, nodding vigorously at every hollow sentence he uttered, desperately hoping to secure their own positions. I ignored all of it. I casually declined his calendar invites for alignment sessions and team-building synergy workshops. I had a real supply chain to run. While Trenton was busy sketching useless pyramids on whiteboards and talking about paradigm shifts, I sat in the cool silence of the server room, typing away on my mechanical keyboard. I worked in the shadows, quietly maintaining the accuracy of our supply chain at a staggering 99.8%. I kept the colossal gears of Omnifair turning smoothly, perfectly, and without a single dropped shipment. I was the silent keeper of the temple, and he was just a loud, incompetent tourist banging on the gates. The hum of the server room was a comforting white noise, a steady rhythm that I had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a late Thursday afternoon, the kind of quiet hour where the week's heaviest lifting was usually done. I was monitoring the real-time routing dashboard when the system flagged a massive, automated dispatch. I watched the screen as my algorithm locked in a colossal order. It was commandeering exactly 80 heavy-duty freight trucks and directing them straight down to the southern tip of Texas. The payload was highly specific and seemingly absurd for the middle of April. The trucks were loaded to the brim with portable space heaters, heavy-duty de-icing salt, thermal blankets, and several tons of strawberry-frosted pastries. To an untrained eye, shipping winter survival gear and sugary snacks to a region currently basking in warm, 80-degree spring weather looked like a catastrophic glitch. Pop-Tarts, specifically the strawberry ones, are a statistically proven high-demand item during natural disasters because they do not require cooking and have a long shelf life. But Trenton did not know that. He only saw numbers on a page that he could not comprehend. I was just pulling up the meteorological subroutines to review the raw data when my office door was practically ripped off its hinges. Trenton stormed in. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He was practically vibrating with rage. He marched straight up to my workstation and violently slammed a thick stack of printed logistical reports onto my desk. The papers scattered across my keyboard. "What the hell is this, Chloe?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls of my office. "Are you completely out of your mind? You are burning millions of dollars of company money on a stupid system error, 80 trucks of winter gear to Texas in the middle of April. Do you have any idea how much this routing mistake is going to cost my department?" I did not flinch. I slowly picked up the scattered papers, stacked them neatly, and pushed them aside. I looked up at him, keeping my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. "It is not a mistake, Trenton," I said calmly. "If you look at the secondary data streams, the algorithm has detected a highly anomalous shift in the polar vortex. A massive, unseasonal front of Arctic air is currently dipping down through the plains and is projected to sweep directly across southern Texas. Furthermore, there is a massive outdoor music festival happening down there this weekend, drawing in over 200,000 out-of-state tourists who are completely unprepared for freezing temperatures. When the grid inevitably fails due to the sudden cold snap, the emergency stockpile demand for ready-to-eat food and heating supplies will spike exponentially within the next 72 hours. We are positioning our inventory to be the sole supplier in a localized crisis zone. It is a highly profitable, perfectly calculated move." Trenton stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sheer arrogance. He aggressively waved his hand, completely dismissing the satellite imagery and meteorological projections I had just brought up on my left monitor. "I do not want to hear your ridiculous excuses about the weather," he spat, leaning over my desk to try and intimidate me. "You are just trying to cover up the fact that your bloated, outdated software is finally failing. I have been telling the board for weeks that your little pet project is a liability. It is a black box of garbage data. We are done doing things your way. I have already signed an agreement to transition our entire logistics network to a modern, prepackaged enterprise solution. It is a streamlined software built by a firm my associate owns. It actually works, and it costs a fraction of whatever you think your time is worth. The blatant nepotism hung heavy in the air. He was going to replace my perfectly calibrated, living intelligence network with a cheap, off-the-shelf program bought from his friend, just to pad his own cost-saving metrics and likely pocket a kickback. The sheer audacity of his ignorance was staggering. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," I stated, my tone colder than the approaching Texas frost. "That generic software cannot handle the micro-variables of our supply chain. It will collapse under the weight of the daily volume." Trenton stood up straight, adjusting his expensive tie with a smug, victorious sneer. "The only mistake here was letting you run this department for so long. You are fired. Chloe, effective immediately. I want you to pack up your desk and be out of this building in 15 minutes. Security will escort you to the lobby. Do not touch another computer." There was no human resources representative present. There was no formal investigation, no performance review, and no severance discussion. It was a brutal, immediate execution of my career, handed down by a man who did not even know how to read the supply chain reports he was holding. The injustice of it was a sharp, physical pain in my chest, a burning sense of unfairness that would make anyone else lash out. Any other person might have screamed, they might have cried, begged for their job, or threatened to sue the company for wrongful termination. I did none of those things. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I simply looked at him, gave a slow, single nod, and turned back to my desk. I reached out and quietly pressed the power button on my dual monitors, plunging the complex data streams into total darkness. I reached behind the central processing unit, unplugged the braided cable of my customized mechanical keyboard, and carefully wrapped it up. It was the only piece of hardware in this entire building that actually belonged to me. I unzipped my backpack, slid the keyboard inside, and threw the strap over my shoulder. I walked past Trenton without saying another word, my footsteps completely silent on the carpeted floor. I walked out of the glass doors and headed toward the elevators, leaving the corporate giant behind me. What Trenton did not know, and what his cheap replacement software would never understand, was that my algorithm was not a static program. It was a highly sensitive ecosystem that required a manual biological calibration key. It was a complex, encrypted sequence of operational parameters that I personally entered into the central mainframe at the start of every single quarter to keep the artificial intelligence grounded in current physical realities and seasonal baseline shifts. I was scheduled to input the new quarterly key tomorrow morning. Without that specific sequence, the system would soon realize it was flying blind and trigger its own defensive protocols. But I was no longer an employee, and I was not going to do them any favors. I stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on Trenton's smug face, leaving Omnifare Provisions entirely at the mercy of its own breathtaking ignorance. I drove north, leaving the concrete canyons of Chicago far behind in my rearview mirror. I rented a secluded, rustic wooden cabin right on the edge of a pristine lake in Upper Michigan. The moment I arrived, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my company-issued smartphone, and powered it down entirely. I tossed it into the bottom of my travel bag and let out a breath I felt I had been holding for 7 long years. For the first time in nearly a decade, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and water gently lapping against the wooden dock, rather than the piercing, high-pitched wail of a server temperature alarm. I spent my days wrapped in a thick blanket on the porch, slowly making my way through a stack of classic detective novels. There was a profound, almost intoxicating peace in my isolation. I was completely disconnected, resting in the quiet while a massive corporate empire blindly marched toward its own execution. Back in the glass towers of Omnifare, a very different kind of atmosphere was brewing. Word reached me later through a few loyal former colleagues that Trenton actually hosted a catered lunch in the executive lounge to celebrate his victory. He proudly strutted around with a glass of sparkling cider in his hand, boasting to anyone who would listen about how he had finally eliminated the primary roadblock to their synergistic future. His newly purchased, prepackaged software was nowhere near ready for deployment, tangled in endless integration delays. Yet, the supply chain continued to function perfectly. Trucks moved, warehouses filled, and deliveries arrived on time. OracleNet was still running its automated routines flawlessly during those first 2 weeks. This initial period of stability only inflated Trenton's massive ego. He truly believed that my absence proved I was nothing more than an overpaid babysitter for a machine that could easily run itself. What Trenton and his sycophants utterly failed to comprehend was that OracleNet was not a static, unthinking tool. It was a highly sensitive, living intelligence that required a steady heartbeat to survive. That heartbeat was the calibration key. Every single month, on the 15th day, the system would pause its highest-level cognitive functions and wait for me to manually input a complex series of encrypted macro variables. This key told the algorithm how to interpret the shifting nuances of the real world, from subtle economic inflation markers to sudden geopolitical trade restrictions. If the 15th of the month passed without that manual update, the system was programmed with a strict fail-safe protocol. It assumed its primary data architect was incapacitated. To prevent catastrophic predictive errors based on outdated macro data, the artificial intelligence deliberately lobotomized itself. It automatically downgraded its operations, shedding its advanced predictive capabilities and reverting to a mode of raw, blind historical data. It stopped looking at the future and started repeating the past. The 15th came and went while I was peacefully sipping tea by the lake, in Chicago. The system quietly shifted gears, and the first eerie cracks in the supply chain began to appear. Without the real-time context I used to provide, the machine started making decisions based purely on what happened exactly 1 year prior, completely ignoring current reality. The loading dock suddenly received chaotic, nonsensical orders. The system forcefully routed massive shipments of premium sunscreen and beach towels to Seattle, Washington, during a week of endless freezing drizzle. Worse still, it authorized the dispatch of thousands of tons of raw barbecue pork products to a rural agricultural region that was currently under a strict federal quarantine due to a severe outbreak of African swine fever. The finely tuned logistics network was slowly transforming into a mindless engine of chaos. The cracks soon widened into visible fractures, but Trenton was absolutely terrified of losing face. When the regional warehouse managers frantically called the headquarters to report the bizarre shipping manifests, Trenton went into full damage control mode. He completely buried the localized error reports, deleting the email threads and locking the digital files. He furiously barked orders over the phone, commanding the exhausted warehouse staff to manually redirect the freight and fix the errors by hand using printed spreadsheets. "Just process the returns manually and keep it off the official records," he demanded over the secure lines. He forced the blue-collar workers to endure brutal, grueling overnight shifts just to physically mask the logistical bleeding. Trenton was desperately slapping cheap bandages on a sinking ship, terrified that the board of directors would discover his brilliant cost-saving strategy was already beginning to rot from the inside out. He thought he could just sweat it out in secret until his new software was ready, completely oblivious to the fact that the real storm had not even begun to make landfall. The storm hit exactly on schedule. It was a weather event of brutal, unprecedented scale. A monstrous wall of Arctic air slammed into southern Texas, bringing plunging temperatures and relentless freezing rain. The massive outdoor music festival became an instant disaster zone. 200,000 shivering attendees flooded the local towns, stripping the supermarket shelves bare in a matter of hours. The demand for emergency supplies, thermal blankets, and ready-to-eat food skyrocketed, just as my algorithm had predicted. But Omnifare Provisions, the undisputed king of the regional supply chain, had absolutely nothing to offer. Because of Trenton, our massive distribution centers were completely empty. Our loading docks sat deserted while the local population desperately sought food and warmth. We were completely paralyzed. In a brutal display of capitalist efficiency, our biggest competitors immediately swooped in. They deployed fleets of emergency supply vehicles, flooded the zone, and utterly swallowed our entire market share in that region in just 3 days. The financial bleeding was instantaneous, and the panic finally pierced Trenton's thick skull. When the $0 revenue reports from the southern sector hit his desk, the color drained entirely from his face. He scrambled out of his luxury office and sprinted down to the basement level where the core information technology team worked. He was sweating profusely, his expensive silk tie torn loose, his eyes wild with a sickening desperation. He violently slammed his fists onto the lead developer's desk. "Divert everything," Trenton screamed, saliva flying from his lips. "I do not care where it is coming from. Take the freight from Oklahoma. Grab the shipments from Louisiana and force them into Texas right now. Manually override the routing protocols. Just get the trucks across the border." The lead developer stared at him in absolute horror. "We cannot just violently inject a massive manual override of that scale into a lobotomized system. The core routing algorithm is currently running on fragile historical baseline data. If we force a massive cross-country diversion without the calibration key, the system will completely shatter." "I am the Chief Strategy Officer," Trenton roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I am giving you a direct order. Force the override immediately, or I will fire every single person in this room right now." Terrified for their livelihoods, the engineers reluctantly typed in the master override commands. It was the digital equivalent of dropping a live grenade into a finely tuned engine. The core routing algorithm instantly snapped under the pressure. But the catastrophe did not end there. In a twist of supreme irony, the cheap, pre-packaged artificial intelligence software that Trenton had recently purchased was currently running in the background, clumsily trying to integrate with our servers. When it witnessed the massive, panicked manual override, its rudimentary machine learning protocols registered the chaotic command as a permanent new behavioral rule. The cheap software hijacked the dispatch network and created a vicious, unbreakable, infinite loop. Suddenly, the entire national distribution fleet went rogue. Hundreds of heavy-duty freight trucks received conflicting, overlapping orders every 60 seconds. Drivers would cross the border into Texas, only for their dashboard consoles to blare with a new command instructing them to turn around and head back to Oklahoma. Once they reached Oklahoma, the system would immediately order them back to Texas. A ghost fleet of massive 18-wheelers began driving in endless, meaningless circles across state lines. They were burning thousands of gallons of expensive diesel fuel, moving at highway speeds, racking up massive toll booth charges by the second, and delivering absolutely nothing. Dispatchers watched their tracking monitors in absolute terror as the digital blips representing our trucks swarmed like confused insects, completely trapped in a digital web of Trenton's own making. The payload inside those trucks transformed the situation from a mere logistical error into a biological and financial nightmare. We were not just shipping steel auto parts or plastic toys. We were transporting highly perishable, temperature-sensitive agricultural goods. Tens of millions of dollars worth of fresh produce, dairy, and raw meat were trapped inside the idling shipping containers. As the drivers were forced to drive in endless circles, their auxiliary refrigeration units slowly began to run out of diesel fuel. The heavy heat of the lower states battered the metal trailers. Inside, the cargo began to rapidly decay. Premium organic tomatoes liquefied into a foul-smelling sludge that seeped out of the trailer doors. Thousands of crates of crisp spring lettuce wilted and turned to brown rot. Milk spoiled, expanded, and violently burst from its plastic gallons, flooding the floorboards and creating an unbearable stench. Dispatchers sat in their cubicles openly weeping as they listened to the frantic, furious calls from exhausted, confused truck drivers who were begging for a final destination that the system absolutely refused to provide. The corporate fallout was apocalyptic. The phone lines at the Omnifair Central Headquarters began to ring all at once, creating a deafening, terrifying chorus of flashing red lights on every single desk. The chief executives and regional managers of the largest supermarket chains in the country were calling, their voices thick with unprecedented rage. They were staring at completely empty produce aisles and turning away angry customers. They were universally threatening to immediately terminate their exclusive decade-long contracts with Omnifair provisions and sue for monumental damages. It was physically impossible to hide the disaster any longer. The catastrophic failure reports finally bypassed Trenton's desperate cover-up attempts and slammed directly onto the heavy mahogany tables of the board of directors. The preliminary numbers were staggering, almost too large to comprehend. The accounting department confirmed that the company had incinerated over $14 million in pure, unrecoverable inventory losses in a span of just 5 days. That horrific figure did not even begin to include the devastating fuel costs, the overtime pay for the stranded drivers, or the massive impending legal fines for breach of contract. Omnifair Provisions was suddenly staring down the barrel of an immediate, localized bankruptcy in their most profitable southern sector. The once quiet, orderly executive floors devolved into a scene of absolute, unmitigated chaos. Senior vice presidents were literally running down the carpeted hallways, screaming at each other over the endless ringing of the phones. The entire corporate empire was violently collapsing under the crushing weight of one man's monumental ignorance, and there was not a single person left in the building who knew how to stop the bleeding. I was hundreds of miles away, sitting quietly on a wooden porch with a cup of herbal tea, completely oblivious to the boardroom execution taking place in Chicago. But corporate secrets are fragile things, and the detailed events of that Friday afternoon meeting quickly became an enduring legend within our industry. I heard the exact play-by-play from former colleagues who were in the room. When the sheer magnitude of the financial hemorrhage became undeniable, the chief executive officer bypassed the internal technology department entirely. In a state of absolute, unadulterated panic, he authorized an unlimited, blank check budget to fly in a rapid response risk management and digital forensics team straight from Silicon Valley. They were led by a man named Marcus. Marcus was not your typical corporate consultant. He was a notorious former black hat hacker who had transitioned into high-stakes enterprise security. He did not wear a tailored suit. He did not care about corporate hierarchy, and he certainly did not care about hurting anyone's feelings. He arrived in a plain black shirt, carrying a heavy metallic laptop, and exuded an aura of absolute, terrifying competence. The moment he stepped off the private jet, he demanded total silence and unrestricted, God-level access to every single server, database, and internal communication log in the building. It took Marcus exactly 3 hours to sift through the digital wreckage, just 3 hours to dissect the infinitely looping trucking routes, the catastrophic memory leaks, and the massive data conflicts caused by the cheap third-party software attempting to forcefully overwrite my core architecture. When he was done, he did not send a polite email to summarize his findings. He bypassed all protocol and demanded an immediate emergency gathering of the entire board of directors, the chief executive officer, and the architect of the disaster himself, Trenton. The atmosphere in the grand executive boardroom was suffocating. Highly paid men and women sat in stiff, terrified silence around the massive oak table, waiting for the verdict. Trenton sat near the middle, his face incredibly pale and glistening with cold sweat, desperately trying to maintain a facade of executive control. Marcus stood at the head of the room. He did not bother with pleasantries, introductions, or soft corporate jargon. He simply connected his machine to the overhead projector and illuminated the massive wall screen with a single, horrifying line graph. The line represented the structural integrity of the company supply chain, and it was a steep, jagged cliff diving straight down into an abyss. "You people were not hacked," Marcus stated, his voice a flat, razor-sharp blade cutting straight through the heavy silence of the room. "You are not dealing with a foreign cyber attack, and you do not have a buggy, failing internal system. What you actually have is a masterpiece of predictive logic." He stepped away from the glowing screen and began walking slowly down the length of the long table. "Your logistics network was essentially a finely tuned Formula One racing car, effortlessly cruising down the track at 300 kilometers per hour. Marcus continued, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room until he stopped directly behind Trenton's chair. He raised his hand and pointed a single, accusatory finger down at the trembling chief strategy officer. And this absolute idiot right here decided to open the door, throw the only qualified driver out the window, forcefully grab the steering wheel, and just passionately hope the car would miraculously learn how to drive itself purely on faith and cheap buzzwords. The room erupted into shocked, furious murmurs. Trenton shot up out of his chair like he had been physically struck, his face violently shifting from pale white to a deep, defensive red. He pointed a violently shaking finger at the projection screen. "That is a complete lie," Trenton shouted, his voice cracking under the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of the entire board. "She sabotaged us. Chloe must have planted a malicious virus or a delayed logic bomb in the source code before I rightfully fired her. She deliberately crippled the infrastructure to exact revenge on the company. This is corporate terrorism, and we should be calling the federal authorities, not listening to this ridiculous consultant." Marcus did not even flinch. He let out a dark, mocking laugh that echoed coldly in the large room. He calmly walked back to his laptop and tapped a single key. The terrifying graph vanished, replaced instantly by a massive, high-resolution image of an internal company document. It was a time-stamped technical log, formally filed in the Central Corporate Registry exactly 1 month prior. "A virus?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with absolute, undiluted contempt. "She did not need to write a virus. She wrote a perfectly clear, legally binding instruction manual, which you apparently lack the basic reading comprehension to understand." Marcus turned to the board and read the text on the screen aloud, pronouncing every single syllable with devastating clarity. "System maintenance note, filed by Senior Data Architect Chloe Ross. Emergency warning. If the monthly biological calibration key is not manually entered into the primary terminal by the 15th day of the cycle, the artificial intelligence will automatically initiate a complete defensive lockdown. It will downgrade all routing protocols to raw historical data to protect the core algorithm from massive corruption caused by outdated macro variables." End of note. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The horrifying truth settled heavily over the room, squeezing the air out of the executive's lungs. There was no ghost in the machine. There was no malicious sabotage. The only fatal flaw in the entire multi-million-dollar supply chain was the fragile, towering ego of Trenton. He had proudly fired the one person holding the keys to the kingdom, and then he had desperately tried to cover up his own catastrophic incompetence while the company bled out on the floor. The chief executive officer slowly stood up from his leather chair. He looked at the projected warning on the wall, and then he turned his dark gaze toward Trenton. There was no visible anger left in his eyes, only a cold, calculating disgust. He raised his hand and slammed his open palm violently onto the solid oak table. The loud crack made several board members physically jump in their seats. "Get her back," the chief executive officer ordered, his voice a low, terrifying growl that left absolutely no room for debate. "I do not care what it takes. I do not care how much you have to beg. You find Chloe Ross, and you give her whatever she demands. If she is not back in control of that system before the stock market opens on Monday morning, we will all be utterly destroyed. And Trenton, if you open your mouth again, I will have you physically thrown out of this building." The execution was complete. The truth had finally been dragged out into the light, and the immense weight of the corporate machine was about to violently pivot, shifting from punishing me to desperately needing me, and sitting in my cabin by the lake, thousands of miles away. I was completely ready for them. I powered on my personal laptop on a quiet Saturday morning. The moment the device connected to the internet, my inbox violently flooded with hundreds of frantic, high-priority messages from the Omnifair domain. But one specific message stood out from the sea of panic. It was an email from the Director of Human Resources, a woman who had never spoken a single word to me during my entire 7 years at the company. The subject line was heavily capitalized and read, "Special Strategic Partnership Opportunity." The body of the text was an absolute masterpiece of pathetic corporate groveling. They praised my visionary leadership, highlighted my invaluable historical contributions to the infrastructure, and politely suggested a highly lucrative short-term consulting arrangement to help the company navigate what they boldly called a minor transitional hurdle. It was almost comical how desperately they tried to mask the scent of their own burning empire. I did not type a single word in reply. I did not entertain their false pleasantries. Instead, I simply clicked forward, typed in the email address of my high-powered personal corporate attorney, and hit send. I was done playing their corporate games. I let the legal professionals handle the execution. My lawyer contacted the board of directors directly to deliver my terms. It was the ultimate, devastating final twist. A set of conditions so ruthless and airtight that they left absolutely no room for negotiation. First, I demanded an independent consulting fee of exactly $1.5 million. This was not payable in weekly installments. It was to be wired in full, upfront, within exactly 2 hours of signing the agreement. Second, I would not step foot inside that Chicago headquarters ever again. 100% of the work would be conducted entirely remotely from my secure, undisclosed location. But the final condition was the true, undeniable masterpiece of my revenge. I required a formal, legally binding document requesting the emergency budget allocation, and it had to be signed personally by Trenton. The contract explicitly forced him to state in writing that his own gross negligence, his baseless arrogance, and his complete lack of technical understanding had directly caused the multi-million-dollar crisis. He had to formally acknowledge his own absolute incompetence and explicitly state he was begging for this emergency funding to fix his own catastrophic failure. My lawyer later described the glorious scene to me in vivid detail. The entire executive suite was gathered around the heavy oak table in the boardroom. The chief executive officer silently slid the printed contract across the polished wood. Trenton stared at the paper, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the pen. He was completely, inescapably cornered. The very same men and women who had previously nodded along to his empty buzzwords now stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust, with absolutely no way out, sweating under the crushing weight of his ruined career. Trenton signed the most humiliating confession of his entire life. Less than an hour later, my secure banking application sent a notification to my phone. The wire transfer of $1.5 million had successfully cleared and was resting safely in my account. I sat comfortably on the wooden porch of my quiet Michigan cabin, feeling the crisp morning breeze rustling through the tall pine trees. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my hot chamomile tea. I opened my laptop and established a heavily encrypted virtual private network connection directly into the Omnifair central mainframe. I effortlessly navigated through the defensive firewalls they had so desperately tried to manually override during the week. I reached the dark screen of the core architecture prompt. I rested my fingers on the familiar mechanical keys and typed exactly 12 characters, the biological calibration key. I hit enter. I leaned back and watched the master diagnostic dashboard. For exactly 40 seconds, the screen remained a chaotic, terrifying sea of flashing red warning indicators. Then, like a massive digital beast suddenly recognizing its master's voice, the artificial intelligence snapped to attention. It instantly absorbed the fresh macro data, reoriented its geographic anchors, and recalculated thousands of optimal delivery routes. The flashing red cascaded into a beautiful solid wave of brilliant green. The infinite trucking loops were instantly shattered. The massive localized gridlock unraveled, and the supply chain surged forward with perfect, terrifying precision once again. Later that exact same afternoon, Trenton was unceremoniously stripped of his security badge and escorted out of the glass building by 4 armed security guards. He did not just lose his shiny title. The board of directors immediately filed a massive, crippling corporate lawsuit against him for gross negligence and malicious destruction of company property. He would spend the rest of his natural life buried in aggressive legal fees, entirely unemployable in the corporate sector. I gently closed my laptop, severing the digital connection to the corporate world. I slipped on my walking shoes and stepped off the porch, heading down toward the peaceful edge of the water. My phone vibrated gently in my pocket. The notifications were still rolling in. I glanced at the screen and saw dozens of new emails from the chief executive officer, desperately begging me to return permanently and offering me the official title of chief technology officer with a blank check salary. I just smiled, swiped across the screen, and confidently hit the button to mark all as read. I had utterly destroyed the man who tried to ruin my life, and I had secured my ultimate financial freedom in a single, brilliantly calculated weekend. The game was officially over. I had won. And from this moment forward, I would be the only one dictating the rules of my life. Thank you so much to all of our incredible listeners for joining me on this journey today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and want to help us keep bringing these tales to life, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. Over there, you will gain access to our absolute best, exclusive true stories featuring incredibly detailed situations and multiple emotional voice actors that are simply too intense to publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the quick response code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the description box and the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay strong out there.